On Christmas Eve, 2 years ago, I found myself driving up to a remote family cabin in Vermont. It was my first time spending Christmas without my family, as I had recently gotten engaged to my fiancée, Emily. We wanted to make new traditions, just the two of us. The cabin was nestled deep in the woods, surrounded by towering pines and a glistening blanket of snow. It felt like a Christmas card come to life. We arrived at the cabin just before sunset. The orange and pink hues of the sky were stunning, and Emily couldn't stop gushing about how picturesque everything looked. The cabin was cozy, with a roaring fireplace, a small decorated Christmas tree, and an inviting stack of blankets on the couch. It felt perfect, at least at first. As the night crept in, the snowstorm began. Big, heavy flakes fell in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees. We lit a few candles for ambience and played Christmas music softly in the background. Emily was in the kitchen preparing hot cocoa while I unpacked the last of our things. That's when I noticed it, a shadow moving outside the window. At first, I dismissed it as the swaying branches or my own shadow reflected by the firelight. But then it happened again, unmistakably. It wasn't a tree branch. Someone, or something, was out there. "Emily," I called, trying to keep my voice steady. "Do you see that?" She joined me by the window, but by the time she looked, the shadow was gone. "It's probably just the wind," she said, brushing it off. I wanted to believe her, but something about it didn't sit right with me. We locked all the doors and windows, more as a precaution than out of genuine fear. The night was peaceful again, at least for a while. Around midnight, we decided to exchange one small gift each, an early Christmas Eve tradition from my family. As Emily handed me a neatly wrapped box, there was a loud bang at the front door. The sound startled us both, and the hot cocoa I was holding spilled across the table. "Who could that be?" Emily whispered. I walked cautiously to the door, my heart pounding. Looking through the peephole, I saw nothing but the swirling snow. No footprints, no visitors. I opened the door a crack to see if someone had left a package or anything unusual, but the porch was empty. "Maybe it was the wind," I told her, though I didn't believe it myself. We tried to shake it off and return to the couch, but the unease lingered. A half hour later, as we prepared to head to bed, the sound came again, this time louder. It wasn't a knock this time. It was scratching, slow and deliberate, like fingernails against wood. Emily clung to my arm as I grabbed the fireplace poker and approached the door again. "Don't open it," she pleaded. "I won't," I assured her, but I needed to know what was going on. I turned on the porch light, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something move beyond the trees, a dark figure. But just as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. The scratching stopped. The snow outside was undisturbed. No tracks leading up to the porch, as if whatever was out there wasn't bound by earthly means. My breath fogged up the window as I leaned in closer, trying to see anything in the dense woods, but there was nothing. "Let's just go to bed," Emily suggested, her voice trembling. We bolted the bedroom door and left the bathroom light on for some semblance of comfort. I wished I could have reassured her, but I was just as scared. The storm raged on, the wind howling and the cabin creaking with every gust. Sleep felt impossible. Then, around 3 a.m., we both woke to a loud thud, followed by the unmistakable sound of heavy boots on the wooden floor. Someone was inside the cabin. I grabbed the fireplace poker again and motioned for Emily to stay quiet. My hands shook as I slowly opened the bedroom door, trying to make as little noise as possible. The living room was empty, but the front door was wide open, snow blowing in and covering the floor. "Stay here," I whispered to Emily, though she was already clutching my arm, refusing to let go. Together, we tiptoed into the living room, my eyes darting around for any sign of movement. Then we heard it, a faint, eerie humming. It was coming from upstairs, where the cabin's attic was. My blood ran cold. No one had been up there since we arrived, and the attic wasn't even accessible from the living quarters. It required a pull-down ladder from the ceiling. "What do we do?" Emily whispered, her face pale. The humming grew louder, a chilling tune that resembled a twisted version of a Christmas carol. Against my better judgment, I climbed onto a chair and pulled the cord to lower the attic ladder. The humming stopped instantly. The silence was deafening. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling in my grip. Emily begged me not to go up, but I needed to know. Slowly, I climbed the ladder, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The attic was freezing, the icy air biting at my face. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing old furniture, cobwebs, and forgotten Christmas decorations. But then I saw it. Something crouched in the corner, facing the wall. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. The figure turned slowly. It was a man, or at least something resembling one. His face was pale and distorted, his eyes sunken and lifeless. He grinned, revealing jagged, yellow teeth, and began humming again, louder this time. My body froze, paralyzed with fear. Emily screamed from below, snapping me out of my trance. I scrambled down the ladder and slammed it shut, pulling the cord up with me. We grabbed our coats and keys and bolted out of the cabin, not caring about the snowstorm or the dark forest. We drove away, the cabin's lights disappearing behind us. The next morning, I called the Airbnb host to report what happened. He was confused, insisting that no one had stayed at the cabin in months before us and that the attic was supposed to be locked. He offered us a refund, but I didn't care about the money. All I knew was that we would never set foot in that cabin again. To this day, I can still hear that haunting, twisted Christmas tune in my nightmares. Last year, just a few days before Christmas, my best friend Rachel and I decided to do something festive. Both of us loved exploring quaint, out-of-the-way places, so we rented a small cottage in a remote part of the mountains. The listing described it as a cozy winter getaway, and the photos showed a snug little home surrounded by snowy pines. It sounded perfect, a chance to unwind and get into the holiday spirit. The drive up was uneventful, apart from the steadily thickening snowstorm that made the last few miles nerve-wracking. By the time we arrived, the light was already fading, and the cottage looked a little more worn down than it had in the photos. The paint was peeling, and one of the upstairs windows seemed to be cracked. Rachel joked that it looked like something out of a Hallmark Christmas movie, if Hallmark did horror. Inside, it wasn't much better. The air was musty, and the furniture was old and creaky, but it was warm, and the view of the snow-covered forest was breathtaking. We lit the fireplace, strung up a few Christmas lights we'd brought, and started making hot cocoa. By the time the storm picked up, we were tucked under blankets, laughing at old holiday movies on Rachel's laptop. Around 10 p.m., the power flickered and went out. At first, we thought it was the storm, but then we noticed something strange. The Christmas lights we'd plugged into a battery pack were still on, casting an eerie glow across the room. That was when we heard it, a soft tapping at the window. We froze, exchanging wide-eyed looks. The cottage was miles from the nearest town, and the snow was so deep that no one could have driven up here. "It's probably just a branch," Rachel whispered, though her voice trembled. The tapping came again, more insistent this time. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the window. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow move, but when I looked closer, there was nothing but the snow piling up against the glass. "Let's just ignore it," Rachel said, trying to sound braver than she felt. We locked all the doors and windows and decided to call it a night. Rachel took the bedroom, and I sat up on the couch in the living room. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and crunching in the snow outside. My heart pounded as I lay there, holding my breath. The sound stopped right outside the front door. I reached for my phone, but there was no service. The fireplace cast flickering shadows across the room, and for a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the glow. I told myself it was my imagination, but then I heard the doorknob jiggle. "Rachel," I hissed, running to her room. She was already awake, her eyes wide with fear. "Someone's outside," I whispered, locking the bedroom door behind me. We huddled together, straining to hear. The jiggling stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic knocking. It wasn't frantic or forceful, but steady, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside knew we were inside and had all the time in the world. "We need to leave," Rachel whispered. "How?" I shot back. "The cars snowed in, and there's no way we'd make it down the mountain on foot." The knocking stopped, but we didn't feel any safer. We sat in silence, clutching a fire poker and a heavy flashlight for what felt like hours. Finally, the first light of dawn crept through the windows, and the knocking didn't return. We cautiously opened the bedroom door and found the living room untouched, except for one thing. The Christmas lights we'd strung up were gone, replaced with a single, crudely carved wooden ornament hanging from the mantel. It was shaped like a heart, but the edges were jagged, and it had been scratched into the wood with deep gouges. Terrified, we decided to leave immediately. We dug the car out as quickly as we could, and as we packed our things, I noticed something chilling. The footprints outside the cottage weren't human. They were too long, too narrow, and they circled the house multiple times, stopping at each window and door. As we drove down the mountain, I glanced back at the cottage one last time. Standing in the upstairs window was a figure, its face obscured, but its hand pressed against the glass. I couldn't tell if it was watching us leave or waiting for us to come back. Rachel and I never spoke of that night again, and I can't even look at Christmas lights without feeling a cold knot of fear in my stomach. Whatever was outside that cottage wasn't human, and it wanted us to know it had been there. Last Christmas, I decided to do something a little different. Instead of spending the holiday with my family, I rented a small cabin in the woods for a quiet, solitary retreat. It wasn't that I disliked Christmas, I just needed some time away from the chaos of life. The cabin was nestled deep in the forest, surrounded by snow-covered trees, and the idea of being completely disconnected for a few days sounded perfect. I arrived on Christmas Eve, just as the sun was setting. The cabin was exactly as advertised, rustic, cozy, and completely secluded. There was no Wi-Fi or cell service, but that was part of the appeal. I spent the evening decorating a small tree I'd brought with me, drinking hot cider and reading by the fire. The only sounds were the crackling of the logs and the occasional gust of wind outside. Around midnight, I stepped out onto the porch to take in the stillness of the snowy forest. The moonlight made everything glow, and the silence was so complete it was almost eerie. That's when I noticed something strange. Just beyond the tree line, I saw a faint light flickering. It wasn't the moon or a reflection. This was a steady, golden glow, like a lantern. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out what it could be. Maybe another cabin? But the nearest property was miles away, and there hadn't been any signs of other people on the drive up. I told myself it was probably just my imagination, or maybe a trick of the light, and went back inside. I locked the door, threw another log on the fire, and went to bed, determined not to let my mind play tricks on me. But I couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a sound that sent chills down my spine. A soft, rhythmic tapping on the window. My cabin had only one main window, facing the porch, and there was no way anyone should be out there. I sat up in bed, heart racing. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was outside wanted me to know they were there. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the window. The tapping stopped just as I reached it. Holding my breath, I shone the light through the glass. At first, I saw nothing, just the snow-covered porch and the dark forest beyond. But then, I noticed something in the snow, just at the edge of the porch. Footprints. They were large and deep, as if made by someone, or something very heavy. I didn't dare open the door to investigate. Instead, I closed the curtains, locked the door again for good measure, and tried to convince myself it was just an animal. But the uneasy feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The next morning, I stepped outside to get a better look at the footprints. They led from the forest to the porch, circling the cabin several times before disappearing back into the woods. But what unnerved me the most was their size. They were too big to belong to a human, yet they didn't look like any animal tracks I'd ever seen. The shapes were elongated, almost like distorted boots. I decided to cut my trip short. As much as I'd wanted peace and solitude, something about this place felt wrong. I packed up my things quickly and loaded them into the car. Just as I was about to leave, I glanced back at the cabin and froze. In the window, the same window where I'd heard the tapping, there was a figure. It was too dark to make out any details, but I could see the outline of a person, or what looked like a person, standing perfectly still, watching me. I didn't stick around to get a better look. I jumped in the car and drove as fast as the icy road would allow, my heart pounding the whole way. Even after I reached the main road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. That night, I stayed in a motel, too shaken to go straight home. As I lay in bed, trying to convince myself it had all been a figment of my imagination, I got a notification on my phone. It was strange since I hadn't had service at the cabin. When I opened it, my blood ran cold. It was a photo of the cabin, taken from the porch. In the picture, the front door was slightly ajar, and standing in the doorway was the same dark figure I'd seen in the window. The timestamp on the photo was from that afternoon, just minutes after I'd left. I deleted the photo immediately, too terrified to think about what it meant. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there in the woods that Christmas. All I know is that I'll never spend another holiday alone, no matter how much I crave peace and quiet. 2 Christmases ago, my cousin Eric invited me to spend the holidays at his new house in a small town nestled in the mountains. He had recently bought an old, fixer-upper Victorian home and was eager to show it off. The house had character, high ceilings, ornate woodwork, and a wraparound porch, but something about it felt off the moment I arrived. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on. It just had a heavy, unsettling vibe. The house had been built in the late 1800s and sat on several acres of land surrounded by thick forest. Eric had decorated it beautifully for Christmas, with lights draped across the porch and a massive tree in the living room. He told me he'd been hearing strange noises at night, footsteps, doors creaking open on their own, but he laughed it off, chalking it up to the house settling. I wasn't so sure. That night, after a big dinner and some eggnog, Eric gave me a tour of the house. It was massive, with a labyrinth of hallways and rooms. In the basement, there was a strange, locked door that caught my attention. It was made of thick, dark wood and had a rusted padlock hanging from it. "What's in there?" I asked. "No idea," Eric said with a shrug. "The realtor didn't have the key, and I haven't gotten around to breaking it open. Probably just old junk." The door made me uneasy, but I didn't press him about it. We headed back upstairs, and I tried to shake the weird feeling that lingered. That night, I stayed in one of the guest bedrooms on the second floor. The room was freezing, despite the heat being on, and the old wooden floors creaked with every step. As I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The house was silent, except for the occasional groan of the wind outside. At around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of faint whispering. At first, I thought it was Eric talking in his sleep, but the whispers were coming from just outside my door. My heart pounded as I strained to hear. The words were muffled, like a conversation between 2 people, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. I mustered up the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, but the whispers continued, now coming from downstairs. I grabbed my phone for light and tiptoed down the stairs, my breath fogging in the icy air. As I reached the living room, the whispers stopped abruptly. The Christmas tree lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. My gaze fell on the basement door. The padlock was lying on the floor, broken. Every instinct screamed at me to go back upstairs, but curiosity got the better of me. I crept down the basement stairs, the old wood groaning beneath my weight. The air grew colder with each step, and a faint, musty smell filled my nose. At the bottom of the stairs, the locked door was now slightly ajar. I hesitated, holding my breath, and pushed it open. Inside was a small, dark room, empty except for a single chair in the center. On the chair sat an old, cracked porcelain doll, its painted eyes staring blankly ahead. Something about the doll made my skin crawl. Its head was slightly tilted, and its hands rested in its lap, almost as if it were waiting for something. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and that's when I heard it, a low, guttural laugh, coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but the basement was empty. The laugh echoed again, louder this time, and the door to the small room slammed shut. I bolted up the stairs, not stopping until I was back in the guest room with the door locked. The next morning, Eric found me pale and shaken. I told him what had happened, and his face grew serious. "You're not the first person to hear things down there," he admitted. He went on to explain that the previous owner had mentioned the basement was trouble, and had sealed the room decades ago after too many incidents. We decided to leave the house that day and spent the rest of Christmas at a hotel in town. Eric sold the house a few months later, but to this day, I can't look at a porcelain doll without feeling sick. Whatever was in that basement wasn't just an old toy. It was something much darker, and it didn't want us there. Last Christmas, my family rented a sprawling lodge in the Colorado mountains for a holiday reunion. It was the first time in years we were all able to gather in one place. My parents, siblings, cousins, aunts, uncles, and grandparents. The lodge was massive, with 7 bedrooms, a stone fireplace, and huge windows that overlooked a dense, snow-covered forest. It was the perfect backdrop for a picturesque Christmas. The first 2 days were magical. We built snowmen, roasted marshmallows, and exchanged early presents. The lodge had a cozy, rustic charm, and the isolation only added to the festive atmosphere. But by Christmas Eve, the mood began to shift. That evening, as we sat around the fireplace sharing stories, the power flickered. My uncle joked about the storm knocking out the power, but the lights stabilized, and we thought nothing of it. Around midnight, the wind outside grew stronger, howling through the trees. My younger cousin Lily, who was only 6, kept looking out the window, her face pale. "Someone's out there," she whispered. We all turned to look, but the only thing we saw was snow and shadows cast by the moonlight. My aunt reassured her it was just her imagination, but Lily wouldn't stop insisting. "He's watching," she said, pointing toward the tree line. Trying to ease her fear, I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the forest. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but snow and bare branches. "See? No one's there," I told her. She didn't look convinced. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up reading by the fire. The house was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden beams. I was just starting to doze off when I heard it, a soft, rhythmic knock at the back door. I froze, listening intently. The knock came again, deliberate and slow. I grabbed the fire poker and approached the door, my heart pounding. Looking through the frosted glass, I saw nothing but the snowy porch. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. There was no response. I turned the lock and opened the door a crack, the icy wind rushing in. The porch was empty, but fresh footprints led from the tree line to the door and then back into the woods. I slammed the door and locked it, my stomach churning with unease. I wanted to wake someone up, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. Instead, I sat by the fire, clutching the poker, until exhaustion finally took over. The next morning, I told my dad about the footprints. He dismissed it, saying it was probably a curious hiker or a local. I wasn't so sure, but I didn't want to ruin Christmas by making a fuss. That evening, as we sat down to dinner, the power went out completely. My uncle lit a few lanterns while my mom lit candles, and we tried to make the best of it. But the sense of unease was palpable. Halfway through the meal, Lily started crying. "He's back," she whimpered, pointing to the window. We all turned, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement, a shadow slipping between the trees. My dad went outside with my uncle to check, but they found nothing. The footprints from the night before had been erased by the fresh snow. That night, the lodge felt different. The warm, festive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. I lay in bed, unable to sleep, listening to every creak and groan of the house. Around 2 a.m., I heard the knocking again, this time louder and coming from the front door. I crept downstairs, gripping the fire poker once more. The knocking stopped as soon as I reached the door, but a chill ran down my spine. Through the window, I saw something in the snow, an object, small and dark, lying just beyond the porch. I opened the door cautiously, stepping out into the cold. The object was a small wooden figurine, crudely carved and painted red, resembling a toy soldier. Its face was grotesque, with sharp, exaggerated features and hollow eyes that seemed to stare into my soul. Terrified, I brought the figurine inside and showed it to my family the next morning. No one could explain how it got there. My mom suggested it might have been left by the lodge owners as part of the Christmas decor, but I could tell she didn't believe it any more than I did. On Christmas morning, we woke to find another figurine on the porch, this one shaped like a woman in a green dress, her face twisted into a sinister grin. The footprints leading to the porch were back, larger and deeper than before. By this point, everyone was on edge. We decided to cut the trip short and leave that day. As we packed up the cars, I felt a heavy sense of dread, like we were being watched. I glanced back at the lodge one last time and saw something, or someone, standing in the upstairs window. The figure was tall and dark, its features obscured, but I could feel its gaze following us as we drove away. To this day, no one can explain what happened at that lodge. I still have nightmares about the figurines and the shadowy figure in the window. Christmas has never felt the same since. 3 years ago, my wife and I decided to spend Christmas in a small, secluded cabin we'd rented near a frozen lake. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, just the two of us. We had both been working long hours and were excited to unplug and relax in the quiet beauty of nature. The cabin was old but charming, with a wood-burning stove, rustic furniture, and a stunning view of the lake. It felt like the perfect place to escape the chaos of the city. The first day was idyllic. We went ice skating on the lake, built a snowman, and sipped hot cocoa by the fire. But as the sun began to set, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the landscape in a dense, suffocating gray. The stillness of the forest felt heavier, almost oppressive, and the cabin, which had seemed so cozy in the daylight, now felt isolated and vulnerable. That night, as we settled into bed, the wind began to howl. It rattled the windows and sent eerie creaks through the old wooden walls. I brushed it off as the natural sounds of an old cabin in the middle of a storm, but my wife seemed uneasy. She kept glancing at the window, as if expecting to see something, or someone, outside. Around 2 a.m., we were jolted awake by a loud bang. It sounded like something heavy had hit the front door. I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy fireplace poker and went to investigate. My wife stayed in the bedroom, clutching her phone, even though we had no signal out there. When I opened the front door, my breath caught in my throat. Lying in the snow was a dead deer. Its body was mangled, its neck bent at an unnatural angle, and its eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the sky. What was even stranger was the lack of blood. It was as if the deer had been dropped there, completely lifeless but untouched by the elements. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but the fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. The forest was silent, save for the wind. I shut the door, bolted it, and told my wife what I'd found. She looked pale, her hands trembling. "We should leave," she whispered. I wanted to agree, but driving down the winding, snow-covered roads in the middle of the night felt just as dangerous as staying put. We decided to wait until morning, though neither of us got much sleep. The next day, the deer was gone. The snow where it had been lying was undisturbed, as if it had never been there at all. My wife and I tried to convince ourselves that we'd imagined it, but deep down, we both knew that wasn't true. We spent the day inside, avoiding the fog and the bitter cold. By evening, the sense of unease had grown unbearable. My wife suggested playing Christmas music to lighten the mood, but every song felt out of place, almost mocking. The holiday cheer felt hollow in the oppressive silence of the cabin. That night, the noises started again. At first, it was the faint sound of footsteps crunching in the snow, circling the cabin. Then came the tapping on the windows, soft at first, then more insistent. We turned off all the lights and sat in the dark, holding each other, too scared to make a sound. Suddenly, there was a loud thud on the roof, followed by the sound of something heavy dragging across it. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if whatever was up there wanted us to know it was there. My wife started to cry, and I gripped the fireplace poker so tightly my knuckles turned white. The dragging noise stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. Then, we heard a deep, guttural growl, so low it seemed to vibrate through the walls. It was unlike any animal sound I'd ever heard. I forced myself to look out the window, but all I could see was the swirling fog and the faint reflection of my own terrified face. When morning finally came, the noises stopped, but the fear lingered. We packed our things as quickly as we could and left the cabin without even eating breakfast. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw something that made my blood run cold. Standing at the edge of the lake was a figure, tall and thin, its features obscured by the fog. It didn't move, didn't try to follow us, but I could feel its gaze boring into me. It stayed there, motionless, until we turned a corner and lost sight of the lake. To this day, I don't know what we experienced at that cabin. My wife refuses to talk about it, and I've tried to convince myself it was just our imaginations running wild. But deep down, I know the truth. There's something in those woods, something that doesn't belong to this world, and it doesn't want to be disturbed.